afternoon. Welcome to the Brown Bag Brief. I'm David Barker, an educator here at the National Museum of the United States Navy. I am proud to introduce retired Lieutenant Commander Dwight Hughes. Dwight writes and speaks in Civil War naval history. He graduated from the Navy Academy in 1967. He served 20 years aboard warships and with river forces in Vietnam. He holds an MA in political science and an MS in information systems management. Dwight authored a Confederate biography, Cruises of the CSS Shenandoah, and is contributing author to the emerging Civil War blog. Dwight, please go ahead and give us your information. There we go.
Okay. All right, there we go. So you can see the first slide of the briefing. So we're ready to go. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. It's great to be back with the Naval Museum again and talking about my new book, Unlike Anything That Ever Floated. I'd like to suggest to you that the Emerging Civil War website, the blog, is a great place to go if you're interested in emerging in Civil War history. A great group of public historians, of which I'm privileged to be a member. I'm somewhat their naval specialist. My website is civilwarnavyhistory.com. I have a number of presentations, including this one, that are available to give to any groups that are interested. So please get in touch with me if you're interested. My new book coming out in March is Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, The Monitor, Virginia, and the Battle of Hampton Roads. And this presentation is based on that book. It'll be available on Amazon as well as from the publisher, Savas Beatty. So with that introduction, well, if you don't know the story, this is the place to begin. If you think you know the story, you might be surprised. All right, March 8th, 1862, in the afternoon, the revolutionary, not to say bizarre, ironclad USS Monitor entered Chesapeake Bay. She had rushed down from New York through gale force winds, almost sinking in the process. Monitor's mission: to defeat the powerful Confederate ironclad ram, the CSS Virginia, before she destroyed the wooden warships of the Union fleet in Hampton Roads. Monitor was a steam-propelled, iron-plated raft with a cylindrical iron gun turret and two 11-inch guns. The flat expanse of deck was barely a foot and a half above the surface. 14 officers and 57 crewmen were encased in the hull below the waterline. Captain John L. Worden ordered an exhausted and dispirited crew to strip the vessel of her sea rig and make every preparation for battle. To mid-19th century mariners, this enclosed, cramped, artificial space, which resembled future submarines, was a radical departure from sailing and fighting on the open decks and in the high rigging of traditional men of war, and not a little frightening. Monitor redefined the relationship between men and machines in war, challenging ancient concepts of honor and valor. These developments paralleled the transformative combat experience of soldiers who began the conflict standing up in open fields, manfully confronting the enemy face to face, but ended up burrowing into trenches and crouching behind elaborate fortifications. Technology had advanced the defense over the offense. Monitor's paymaster, William Keeler, commented to his wife, "You may rest assured your better half will be in no more danger from rebel compliments than if he was seated with you at home. There isn't enough danger to give us any glory. Not a man is exposed in action. Our boilers and our entire machinery are completely and effectually protected." Monitor would become a cultural icon of American strength and ingenuity in advertisements for everything from whiskey to refrigerators. She embodied social and institutional as well as industrial revolutions. But this would be a largely symbolic role, which would far outshine her actual accomplishments beyond a single engagement in a specific set of circumstances. After the battle between the Monitor and the Virginia, the Union caught Monitor fever. 50 monitors would be built in a bewildering range of 1, 2, and 3 turret classes. But as a warship type, they were not up to the hype and proved to be of limited utility. With their low profile, monitors were not seagoing vessels and were not effective against shore fortifications, although they did neutralize several Confederate ironclads. The most important technical innovation was the rotating armored turret, which would evolve into 20th century battleships. But during Monitor's construction, public opinion had been decidedly ambivalent concerning this strange watercraft. The technological transition in one generation from horse-drawn transportation to huge locomotives had been breathtaking. On the water, tall warships had always inspired awe, but so far they looked much the same, even when driven by steam as well as sail. It was not clear where little Monitor fit in this revolution. Was she even a ship, or just a small, ironclad two-gun battery that presumably propelled itself? Many could not conceive that a slab of iron would float. One Vermont reporter could hardly find words. Monitor is unlike anything that ever floated on Neptune's bosom. The impression at a short distance is that it is that of insignificance and harmlessness. But on standing upon its deck and looking upon it more closely, the impression is that of great power and invulnerability. The description of the Leviathan of the Scriptures very adequately expresses the feeling which this sea monster excites. The vessel had a most singular appearance, wrote Chief Engineer Alban C. Stimmers. From a half-mile distance, she appeared to be sinking. The hull was not visible, while the turret sat upon the water by itself. People said she looked like a washtub on a raft, a cheese box on a plank, a hat on a shingle, etc., etc. Nathaniel Hawthorne would write, it looked like a gigantic rat trap, ugly, questionable, suspicious, evidently mischievous. Nay, I will allow myself to call it devilish. Monitor's captain, John L. Worden, recalled, here was an unknown, untried vessel with all but a small portion below the waterline, her crew to live with the ocean beating over their heads. An iron coffin-like ship of which the gloomiest predictions were made, her crew shut out from sunlight and the air above the sea, depending entirely on artificial means to supply the air they breathe. A failure of the machinery would be almost certain death to her men. Monitor proceeded across Chesapeake Bay as evening descended. They heard heavy guns in the distance. Plumes of smoke hung over the land. Little black spots sprang into the air, paused for a moment, and expanded into large white clouds. Gun flashes lit the darkening horizon. Bursting shells flashed in the air. The pilot informed them that the dreaded Virginia was raking havoc in Hampton Roads. The USS Cumberland was sunk, and the USS Congress was ablaze. Numerous vessels were fleeing, quote, like a covey of frightened quails. Their lights danced over the water in all directions. Steam frigate USS Minnesota, the most powerful ship the Navy could deploy, had run hard aground off Newport News earlier in that day while pursuing the marauding Virginia. The rebel ironclad Shirley would return in the morning to complete her destruction. Captain Worden was ordered to take Monitor to defend Minnesota. An atmosphere of gloom pervaded the fleet, recalled Lieutenant Samuel Green. The pygmy aspect of the newcomer did not inspire confidence among those who had witnessed the destruction of the day before. The USS Congress blazed like a gigantic torch stuck in the mud where she had been pulverized by Virginia. Around 2 a.m. that morning, she blew up. Wrote Lieutenant Green, certainly a grander sight was never seen, but it went straight to the marrow of our bones. Near us, too, at the bottom of the river, lay the USS Cumberland with her silent crew of brave men who died while fighting their guns to the water's edge. The USS Monitor entered Hampton Roads, cleared for action, and anchored near the Minnesota. Her journey to this point had been as unprecedented as the impending battle. So let us step back a bit and look at her origins. New developments in naval armaments in the middle of the 18th and 19th century, larger guns, explosive shells, rifled bores, had rendered wooden warships increasingly vulnerable, while significant improvements in iron armor had been made, as demonstrated in the recent Crimean War. A furious ironclad arms race was on in Europe. The French launched the first ironclad battleship, the Gloire, in November 1859. In 1860, the British produced the magnificent HMS Warrior, the first fully iron-hulled warship, and the most advanced, most powerful in the world. The U.S. Navy had been in the forefront of developments in steam propulsion and naval armaments. In the 1840s and 50s, the Navy ceased building sail-only warships altogether, while developing advanced wooden steam cruisers, culminating in the powerful Merrimack frigate class. These powerful warships were equal or superior to conventional European frigates and recognized as such by rival European navies. But America had no far-flung empire to defend and no neighboring threats. United States naval strategy focused on harbor and coastal defense, with swift cruisers like Merrimack to protect commerce in distant waters. Americans were content to allow Europeans to pursue costly experiments in the unproven technology of iron armor. But secession and blockade altered the strategic picture dramatically. Europe, particularly Great Britain and France, suffered shortages of cotton, disruptions in industry, trade, and finance, high unemployment, social and political unrest. Great Britain seriously considered intervening on behalf of the Confederacy, perhaps forcefully. British support for rebel commerce raiding and blockade running enraged the United States. Arguments over the roles and responsibilities of neutral countries in wartime harken back to 1812 and the Revolution. The specter of a third war with Great Britain, the world's most powerful nation, now armed with ironclads, became real and immediate. In the summer of 1861, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles struggled with the notion of ironclad vessels. It was a subject, quote, full of difficulty and doubt, he told Congress. England and France had built large, powerful seagoing ironclads. The United States had none. It was evident that a new and material element in maritime warfare was developing itself and demanded immediate attention. Iowa Senator James Grimes supported the development of ironclads. We need a more effective blockade, he wrote. Scoundrels north as well as scoundrels south are carrying on an unlawful trade in fraud of our revenue. Pirates and sea rovers must be captured. Southern harbors and forts must be retaken. Commerce must be protected and northern harbors defended. Suppose England, in her love for cotton, should attempt to break our blockade, and we should get into trouble with her. What is to become of our northern cities and our cities upon the coast? He wished to protect his country and preserve it in all its parts. Secretary Wells was overseeing an immense, unprecedented warship procurement and building program while instigating a nearly impossible continent-wide blockade. It would not be advisable in the current crisis, he concluded, to commit heavy expenditures, quote, by way of experiment on unproven technology and ironclads. He recommended appointment of a proper and competent board to inquire into and report on the subject before Congress considered larger appropriations for operational vessels. The most immediate threats were Confederate ironclads under construction in Norfolk, Mobile, and New Orleans, particularly the former USS Merrimack, now the CSS Virginia. The Mobile Register boasted that the new weapon, quote, would be a floating fortress that will be able to defeat the whole Navy of the United States and bombard its cities. With her great size, strength, powerful engines, and invulnerable iron casing, she would easily destroy or disperse the blockading fleet. She could throw bombs into Fort Monroe. We hope to hear that she is ready to commence her avenging career on the seas. Northern public opinion was aroused also. The Philadelphia Examiner thought it curious that the United States should be so behind the age. If we intend to have a national naval force worthy of our power and pretensions, we shall have to build iron-cased vessels as France and England have done and are doing. Congress directed Secretary Wells to appoint an ironclad board to investigate plans and specifications for constructing iron or steel-clad steamships or steam batteries, appropriating for that purpose $1.5 million. He selected 3 senior line officers, 2 commodores, crusty old salts of the wood and canvas Navy, veterans of the War of 1812, and 1 commander. The board advertised for proposals and from them recommended 3 designs to be produced simultaneously. The first 2 were conventional wooden hulls with iron cladding, broadside battery, steam propeller, and sailing rig. They would become the USS New Ironsides and the USS Galena. The final board selection was proposed by Swedish engineer John Ericsson. The intense, stocky Ericsson, born in 1803, had a long career in Sweden, England, and America, designing, building, and improving steam engines. He produced a host of inventions, including the shipboard steam condenser, and collected numerous patents. Ericsson's proposal possessed, recalled Secretary Wells, extraordinary and valuable features for coast and river blockade. It involved a revolution in naval warfare. President Lincoln remarked, "All I have to say is what the girl said when she put her foot into the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it." Ericsson's low-profile concept was inspired by Swedish lumber rafts that he saw as a child. He never claimed to have invented the revolving armored turret. The idea had been circulating among engineers for decades, but he was the first to successfully deploy it. The ironclad board had serious reservations, but reluctantly agreed to proceed with the experiment. The plan addressed the critical requirement, a combat-ready craft suitable for restricted waters to be rapidly constructed and deployed. In its favor were presumed invulnerability, small size, shallow draft, and limited exposed target area. Worrisome unknowns included over-reliance on steam power, in other words, it didn't have any sails, semi-submerged hull, questionable stability, and untried turret-mounted armament. Other problems included uncomfortable living conditions, limited seaworthiness, and restricted space to operate and maintain guns and machinery. The contract was signed on October 4th, 1861 for an ironclad shot-proof steam battery. John Erickson and his backers were to deliver the vessel complete and ready for service within the unprecedented span of 100 days for a price of $275,000. Erickson lit the fuse on a frenetic and incredibly complex manufacturing process using civilian facilities because Navy shipyards had no capabilities to produce ironclads. He orchestrated a conglomerate of 9 contractors and multiple subcontractors working simultaneously in at least 7 Northeast cities to produce raw materials, angle iron, bar iron, plate iron, and rivets, and finished components for assembly at Continental Iron Works in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Most of these firms clustered around New York City and Albany, centers of steam engine and iron manufacturing. They applied methods and materials in common use for locomotives and other land products. He essentially invented the process of civilian contracting for shipbuilding. Only Yankees could produce an experimental ironclad vessel from scratch in 100 days. Despite the rush, Erickson did not scrimp on furnishings and gadgets. Officers' closet-sized staterooms were appointed in Victorian opulence out of Erickson's own purse, while crewmen slept in hammocks on the more utilitarian berth deck. 6-inch round glass windows, or deck lights, set in the deck overhead, supplemented by oil lamps, provided meager illumination. Erickson crafted a compact 400 horsepower steam engine with a single cylinder, 40 inches in diameter, driving 2 horizontal pistons. Auxiliary steam engines, an uncommon feature at the time, drove the turret and ventilation blowers. A steam condenser provided fresh water. The guns were mounted in customized low-profile friction carriages to dampen recoil in the confined turret. Erickson installed the first custom-designed pressure flushing below the waterline water closets or heads. Surgeon Daniel Logue suffered the indignity of being blown off the seat by a jet of water when he operated the flushing valves in the wrong order. Gideon Wells selected as commander 27-year veteran Lieutenant John L. Worden. Worden had been captured by Confederates the previous year while running secret dispatches to Fort Pickens in Florida, becoming the conflict's first prisoner of war. He was confined in Alabama for 8 months before being exchanged and was still ill and weak when he assumed command. Lieutenant Samuel Dana Green was named executive officer. The 22-year-old Marylander graduated from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis in June 1859. Green represented the young professional officer corps, educated at the new school, steeped in new technologies, and fired in the crucible of war to lead the Navy into the 20th century. With little public notice, on a drizzly morning of January 30th, 1862, Monitor slid down the ways into the East River before a large, spontaneous crowd. The New York Tribune wrote, "The assemblage cheered rapturously as the strange-looking craft glided swiftly and gracefully into its new element. Nearby vessels fired salutes. Predictions that she would break her back or swamp upon launching were disproven. The CSS Virginia was expected to appear in Hampton Roads any day, so work continued around the clock to complete fitting out. Despite futile attempts at secrecy, journalists swarmed the ship, leaving in their reporting nothing to the imagination. Worden sought volunteers from warships in New York Harbor. He described to them the probable perils of passage and the certainty of combat. Many more enthusiastically responded than were required. A better crew no naval commander had ever had the honor to command, Worden would write. Few of them had pre-war sea service. Most were recent recruits with little or no maritime experience. Some were European immigrants, and at least 2 were African American. These volunteers endured ribbing from fellow seamen. In a solemn and prophetic tone, one old salt proclaimed, "You fellows certainly got a lot of nerve or want to commit suicide, one or the other." Several of the new volunteers took one look at Monitor and promptly deserted. After hurried and superficial testing, Monitor got underway for Hampton Roads on March 6, 1862. On the morning of Saturday, March 8th, as Monitor approached the entrance to Chesapeake Bay, a frustrated commander-in-chief convened a council of war to prod Major General George B. McClellan into action on his proposed campaign to capture Richmond. He planned to land at Urbana on the Rappahannock, but as General Joe Johnston fell back from Manassas, McClellan decided instead to invade the peninsula at Fort Monroe. Throughout that afternoon, telegrams filtered into Washington as the former USS Merrimack, now the CSS Virginia, sallied forth into Hampton Roads. The Merrimack is close at hand. The Merrimack is engaging the Cumberland at close quarters. The Congress is now burning. For a while, the news looked very badly, recalled Presidential Secretary John Hay. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton ordered that the news be made public at once to alert northern ports that they were in great danger. The next morning, Sunday, March 9th, wrote a senior Treasury official, was, quote, as gloomy as any that Washington had experienced since the beginning of the war. The president called an emergency session at the White House for a much alarmed cabinet. John Hay reported that panic was intense at Willard's Hotel. Nothing was too wild to be believed, he wrote. Presidential Secretaries John Hay and John Nicolay characterized this cabinet meeting as, quote, perhaps the most excited and impressive of the whole war. Gideon Welles was asked what could be done to counter this formidable monster. The Navy Secretary had no answers beyond faith in the untried Monitor. She should have arrived in Hampton Roads the day before, but due to a break in the telegraph cable, they had no news of her. Welles recorded in his diary that the most frightened man was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He was at times almost frantic. Stanton's words were broken and denunciatory. The panic under which he labored added to the apprehension of others. According to Welles, Stanton insisted that the rebel ironclad could change the whole character of the war. She could destroy every naval vessel and take Fortress Monroe. McClellan's campaign against Richmond must be abandoned. General Burnside's forces must be recalled from the North Carolina Sounds. The vital blockading base of Port Royal Sound must be given up. Virginia would come up the Potomac, disperse Congress, and destroy the capital. She might go to New York and Boston and destroy those cities and hold them for ransom. The Army Secretary was contemptuous of the notion that a 2-gun iron raft could stop her. Secretaries Nicolay and Hay wrote that Stanton, quote, walked up and down the room like a caged lion. Secretary Chase was impatient. Secretaries Welles and Seward were hopeful. General McClellan was dumbfounded and silent. The president was, quote, as usual in trying moments, composed but eagerly inquisitive, critically scanning the dispatches, interrogating the officers, joining scrap to scrap of information, applying his searching analysis and clear logic to read the danger and find the remedy. The possibilities of the hour were indeed sufficiently portentous to create consternation. Welles caustically described Stanton peering out the window of the White House with an expansive view down the Potomac expecting a rebel shell or cannonball to land in the White House before they left the room. But Wells assured them that Virginia was so loaded down with armor, she could not venture outside Hampton Roads. She could not ascend the river and surprise us with a cannonball. Certainly, she could not attack simultaneously every city and harbor on the coast. It would better become us, Wells advised, to consider the situation and inspire confidence by acting so far as we could, intelligently and with discretion and judgment. Stanton telegraphed governors and major cities of the North to man their forts and place timber rafts and other obstructions at the mouth of their harbors. Preparations were made to block the Potomac. Finally, that Sunday afternoon, the chattering telegraph produced the lost message of the night before. Monitor had arrived and will take care of the Virginia. The president and his cabinet anxiously awaited the outcome. In Hampton Roads that morning, the USS Minnesota was still hard aground, the crew making hasty preparations to abandon ship with Monitor anchored nearby. Fog lifting from the water about 8 a.m. revealed the CSS Virginia approaching. Minnesota's captain declared to Monitor's Captain Worden, "If I cannot light my ship off the shoal, I shall destroy her." Worden assured him, "I shall stand by you to the last if I can help you." "No, sir, you cannot help me," was the reply. Within the dim, claustrophobic metal drum of Monitor's turret, 20 feet in diameter, behind 8 inches of iron, squatted the two immense 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbores. Lieutenant Green supervised 16 brawny sailors packed in 8 to a gun. None of them had been drilled on these guns in this turret. Captain Worden took station on the pilot house platform near the bow, his head and shoulders in the box. Peering through the half-inch viewing slit, jammed at his elbow was the pilot and the helmsman. The only communication between pilot house and turret was via runners between the two stations. Below the turret, recalled Paymaster Keeler, everyone was at his post, fixed like a statue. The most profound silence reigned. If there had been a coward heart there, its throb would have been audible. So intense was the stillness. I experienced a peculiar sensation. I do not think it was fear, but it was different from anything I ever knew before. We were enclosed in what we supposed to be impenetrable armor. We knew that a powerful foe was about to meet us. Ours was an untried experiment, and our enemy's first fire might make it a coffin for us all. The suspense was awful as we waited in the dim light, expecting every moment to hear the crash of our enemy's shot. Worden charged directly for Virginia, placing little Monitor directly between Minnesota and the foe. In the gloom below, Keeler heard the muffled whomp of a gun, then another and another. Virginia and Minnesota blasted away at each other at long range, skipping shells along the water's surface. Rounds could take 20 to 40 skips. Several friendly rounds bounced off Monitor. Wrote Keeler, "The infernal howl of the shells as they flew over our vessel was all that broke the silence and made it seem still more terrible." Captain Worden closed about a third of a mile, altered course, and ordered, "Commence firing." The mammoth gun port cover rumbled open. The big black muzzle protruded. Lieutenant Green yanked the firelock string at 8:45 a.m. The entire structure throbbed and trembled with a deafening concussion as the 8-ton behemoth leapt inward. The rebel ironclad turned her head upstream and replied with a broadside, followed by a volume of musketry, which rattled on our iron deck like hailstones, but caused no damage. These first shots made quite a sensation on the worried gunners inside the turret. Worden expected that most rebel shots against the curved exterior would glance off without damage. But he worried that a shot fired directly in line with the vertical axis of the turret could deform the structure and jam the rotating mechanism. The captain also feared that hundreds of bolts and rivet heads holding together 8 layers of 1-inch iron plates would blast off inside when hit from the outside, creating lethal projectiles inside the turret. In either case, Monitor would be helpless. But he reported a 150-pound projectile hitting straight on from 30 yards created a smooth dent, a perfect mold of the shell, 2.5 inches deep. The indentation carried right through 8 inches of 1-inch plate without cracking or splitting the iron. To everyone's relief, enemy fire did not dislodge a single rivet head, and the turret continued to revolve without problems. One rebel shell struck the vulnerable deck edge and tore up one of the plates. Worried that the blow might open a seam below the waterline, Worden crawled out of the gun port, walked to the side, lay down upon his chest to examine the damage with bullets zinging off the iron deck as thick as hailstones in a storm. The hull was uninjured, except for a few splinters of wood, so he crawled back into the turret. Worden announced to the crew that Virginia could not sink them if we let her pound us for a month. The men cheered. Guns bellowed through choking white smoke shot with flame. Rounds screamed, clanged, boomed, and splashed all around. Engines thumped and clanked. Blowers roared. Black clouds billowed from stacks. The big propellers thrashed the water. Men trapped inside, many stripped to the waist with scraps of cloth around their ears, shouted, sweated, and struggled to manage their mental monsters. Virginia's acting captain, Lieutenant Catesby Jones, reported, "We were often within a ship's length of Monitor. Once, while passing, we fired a broadside at her only a few yards distant. She and her turret appeared to be under perfect control. Her light draft enabled her to move about us at pleasure." Ironclad against ironclad, recalled Monitor's chief engineer, Stimmers. "We maneuvered about the bay here and went at each other with mutual fierceness." They circled awkwardly in what would appear to a modern observer as slow motion. 5 times during the engagement we touched each other, wrote Lieutenant Green. And each time I fired a gun at Virginia, and I will vouch that the 168 pounds penetrated her sides. The shot, shell, grape, canister, musket, and rifle balls flew about us in every direction, but did us no damage. Our tower was struck several times, and though the noise was pretty loud, it did not affect us any. Inside the turret, 2 men leaned against the bulkhead just as rebel shot whanged against the outside, knocking them senseless. Both recovered by the following morning. These were the only injuries among the crew. "The effect of one shut up in a revolving drum is perplexing," wrote Lieutenant Green. Both vessels were continuously turning, backing, and forwarding, while the turret spun independently. This was not your traditional man-of-war broadside gun deck. Green could see out only through a few-inch gap between the gun muzzle and the top of the gun port, a favorite target for Eagle rebel muskets on Virginia. Through smoke, noise, concussion, and the whirling of the turret, the lieutenant was disoriented and frequently blind. He could not see the enemy. A rebel projectile entering an open gun port would put them out of action. He could not see how his guns were pointed relative to his own vessel. A careless round striking the pilot house directly in front of the turret would end the fight. To make matters worse, the steam-driven turret was slow to start, and once moving, slow to stop, even slower to reverse. Like all Monitor's machinery, these mechanisms were undergoing their first combat trial. Green found it nearly impossible to stop rotation in line of fire, open the gun port, sight and shoot at a target that was itself moving. So he settled on a pattern. Rotate the turret away from Virginia and stop to load, leaving the heavy gun ports open to save time and effort. Then when ready, start revolving again and fire both guns on the fly as the target swept past the muzzles. Green personally aimed and fired every round. To Virginia's Lieutenant John Taylor Wood, Monitor appeared but a pygmy. But in her size was one great element of her success, he wrote. The Monitor was firing every 7 or 8 minutes, and nearly every shot struck. When Monitor's turret revolved, we could see nothing but 2 immense guns, recalled a rebel Marine. Those guns bellowed and promptly disappeared while his gun crew struggled to respond. Lieutenant Jones wondered how the Yankees could take aim so quickly. But he wrote, the Virginia, however, was a large target, and generally so near that Monitor's shot did not often miss. It did not appear to us that our shell had any effect on the Monitor. Jones maneuvered his lumbering vessel for nearly an hour, trying to ram and board Monitor. But Worden turned away and suffered only a glancing blow. In the process, Monitor just missed Virginia's submerged stern, almost snapping off her rudder and propeller. As Monitor slid by, Virginia's after pivot gun delivered a 68-pound rifle shell right against the pilot house from about 20 yards. Captain Worden's eyes were close behind the viewing slit. The explosion cracked and almost broke the iron box, flooding it with light. Paymaster Keeler stood below the platform awaiting orders. A flash of light and a cloud of smoke filled the house, he wrote. I noticed the captain stagger and put his hands to his eyes. The blood was running from his face, which was blackened with powder smoke. My eyes, Worden said. I am blind, but do not mind me. Save the Minnesota if you can. Lieutenant Green came forward from the turret to assume command. The pilot and the helmsman were shaken but not injured, while a stunned and partially blinded Worden ordered the helm to starboard, turning Monitor away from the action into shallow water, where Virginia could not follow and her guns could not reach. Seeing Monitor withdraw, Minnesota's captain ordered every preparation to destroy the ship. But the rebel ironclad did not approach. Evening was descending, the tide was ebbing, Virginia was damaged and low on ammunition. Lieutenant Jones decided to retire with confidence that the contest could be resumed the next day. Confederates would excoriate him for leaving Minnesota in enemy hands. Now in command of Monitor, Lieutenant Green longed to re-engage, but Virginia was retreating. He had to cover Minnesota. Another hit on the pilot house could be disabling, and their wounded captain needed attention. So at about 12:15, Monitor let go a few last shots, and she turned away. Lieutenant Green also would be criticized for this decision by armchair admirals. Paymaster Keeler climbed through the iron hatch to a deck strewn with shell fragments. Virginia's parting shot shrieked over their heads and exploded about 100 feet away. Small steamers and boats from Newport News, Fort Monroe, and the various men of war surrounded them, all eager to learn the extent of our injuries and congratulate us on our victory. Thousands of spectators were astonished to learn that Monitor was uninjured and ready to resume the fight. Aboard Minnesota, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox had seen the whole fight. He hailed down from the high deck to monitor that they had, quote, fought the greatest naval battle on record and behaved as gallantly as men could, wrote Lieutenant Green to his parents. I felt proud and happy then, Mother, and felt fully repaid for all I had suffered. When told that Minnesota was saved, Worden said, then I can die happy. Future Admiral John Worden would recover most of the sight in his right eye, but his face was permanently blackened and his left eye destroyed. Monitor was struck 22 times, twice on the pilot house, 9 on the turret, 8 on the side armor, and 3 on deck. Lieutenant Green reported that his underclothes were black with smoke and powder. His nervous system was shot. Every bone ached. He could hardly stand. My nerves and muscles twitched as though electric shocks were continually passing through them, and my head ached as if it would burst. Sometimes I thought my brain would come out right over my eyebrows. I lay down and tried to sleep. I might as well have tried to fly. Thank you. Ready for questions.
All right. Well,
There you go.
I want to say thank you very much.